Good evening. I'm Juliana Campfield. I'm the director of Deutsches Haus at NYU. Welcome to our event with Peter Wortsman and Christian Martin, which will center around Stimme und Atem, out of breath, out of mind. Peter Wortsman's most recent book. He will be reading from this book, and then he and Christian Martin will have a conversation about the book and Peter's writing and translation and living in different cultures and languages and the elections. No, not about the elections. We will not talk about the elections today. This is just like Fight Club, so that we all keep our mental health for a few more days. In any case, I'm so pleased that we're doing this event. Both Peter and Christian are old friends of Deutsches Haus, and I may say also old friends of mine. So I'm really delighted that this is happening today. And I want to thank them both for agreeing to have this conversation here during a particularly busy time. I'm saying Dankeschön to both of you. And I want to thank my colleagues Sarah Girner, Adriana Diaz, Nicole Hohmann for working hard to make this event happen. And Sarah is running our technology here tonight. Sarah, thank you so much for doing that. I could never do that, so I'm particularly grateful for that. I want to thank the DAAD for their continued support of our academically inclined events. And of course, I want to thank you, the audience, for making time during this extraordinary I don't even know what to call this. I guess time we find ourselves in, and juggling and negotiating so many challenges in everyone's life. So I'm pleased you're here, and I look forward to your questions and comments later. But now let me introduce both Peter and Christian so that you know a little bit more about them. Oh, I should perhaps, before I do that, tell you about a few more upcoming events at Deutsches Haus that you might be interested in. So next week on October 28th, I think we have an event, a political event, so to speak, but of course, all events are somewhat political these days. And this will be called American Illiberalism Viewed from Abroad. And on November 5th, we have another political event, Sovereignty Inc., 3 Inquiries into Politics and Enjoyment. And on November 18th, we'll have another literary event, Kraft, a conversation between Jonas Lüscher, Tess Lewis, and Ulrich Baer. So if you enjoy this event, you should definitely return to one of the up and coming events, and especially the literary event on November 18th. That is what the algorithm would probably suggest, since you're viewing and hopefully participating in this event. And now I will really start, I promise, with the introduction. Here we go. Peter Wortsman is the author of 3 collections of short fiction: A Modern Day to Die, Footprints in Wet Cement, and of course, Stimme und Atem, Out of Breath, Out of Mind. Hi, Peter. A novel, Cold Earth Wanderers, an independent publisher, book award-winning travel memoir, Ghost Dance in Berlin. We did a wonderful book launch in 2013, I think, with you and Tess Lewis, and that's a very nice memory when I read this title. A book of doctors' profiles, The Caring Heirs of Dr. Samuel Bard, as well as 2 stage plays, Burning Words, and more recently, The Tattooed Man Tells All, first staged by the Silverthorne Theater in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and slated to be staged in a German translation at the Deutsches Theater in Göttingen later this year. And I should mention that the Silverthorne production will be screened, a film version will be screened on November 13th and November 14th in the evening. If you would like to find out more, you can email me, then I can provide these details to you. Peter's travel writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other respected newspapers, journals, and websites, and was included 5 years in a row from 2008 until 2012, and again in 2016 in Traveler's Tales, the best travel writing. His travel narrative, Protected, won the 2012 Gold Grand Prize for Best Travel Story of the Year in the Solus Awards for Best Travel Writing. Peter is also a critically acclaimed literary translator from the German into English of works by Adalbert von Chamisso, the Brothers Grimm, Heinrich Heine, E.T.A. Hoffmann, Franz Kafka, Heinrich von Kleist, and Robert Musil, among many others. He was a 1973 Fulbright Fellow and 1974 Fellow of the Thomas J. Watson Foundation and a 2010 Holtzbrinck Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. All right, that's you, Peter. I'm sure we could add a lot of additional information, but we'll leave that for you to mention as part of the conversation. Christian is a professor of political science at the University of Kiel, Germany. He currently holds the Max Weber Chair in German and European Studies at the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies at NYU, and is a very esteemed scholar and wonderful colleague. Christian studied political science at the University of Konstanz and holds a doctorate from there. He was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Konstanz and at the Max Planck Institute in Jena, an assistant professor at the University of Hamburg, and a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University. Christian's research interests focus on the political conditions and consequences of globalization and regional integration. He has published inter alia on the effects of globalization for electoral participation and on the incentive to adopt more proportional voting systems in a highly globalized environment. His current research project is on backlashes against globalization and EU integration, including the electoral success of the far-right AfD in Germany and the demise of social democracy. I should also mention that he's an expert in living in 2 different languages and cultures, which qualifies him very well for this event. And he's very much a literary aficionado, and Christian and I have had wonderful literary discussions. I very fondly remember one about Der Zauberberg, and I'm sure we'll profit from his wonderful thoughts about literature and culture tonight. So normally I would now say, please join me in welcoming our panelists, but now I will just be clapping by myself. I hand things over to you.
So shall I begin? I'm very moved to be here, so to speak. That is, I terribly miss the confines of the Deutsches Haus, where I somehow feel safe, but here we are in the, cyberland. Thank you, Juliana Campfield and Sarah Gerner, for hosting and organizing this virtual event under the auspices of NYU Deutsches Haus. Thank you, Christian Martin, for engaging in this evening's dialogue. Christian and I first struck up a congenial conversation at an event at Deutsches Haus some years ago, but we clinched our friendship over lychee martinis at La Lanterna di Vittorio, a watering hole very nearby. And I sincerely hope that we can all repair there at some point in the future, in the near future, to celebrate health and hopefully to celebrate a change in the direction of our country. Some of you out there know me primarily as a writer in English. Others know me as a literary translator of German, Romantic, and modern classics. It is a great relief to finally put the 2 sides of myself together and present to you today my new bilingual German-English book of stories, Stimme und Atem, Out of Breath, Out of Mind, most of which I originally wrote in German and then adapted into English, published by Palm Art Press in Berlin. Just advertising the book, holding it up here. The book cover was designed by my publisher, Catherine Nicely, based on an original print by my brother, artist and sculptor Harold Wortsman. It makes it look a bit like a talking sculpture, and I'm very proud of this. Writing and translation have always been part and parcel of the same process for me, an attempt to find the right words to fit what I'm thinking and feeling, and tell a story or 2 to keep myself and others entertained. To tell the truth, I have long been and still am linguistically confused, having grown up as the child of German-speaking Jewish refugees from Vienna, with German as my private family tongue and English as my public channel of communication. Some 33 years ago, I added French to the cocktail of confusion, the language of the little clan I built with my wife Claudie, daughter Aurélie, and son Jacques. Depending on my state of mind, the context and locale, if I've had a full night's sleep, which I'm not getting these days, or I'm suffering from one of my recurrent bouts of insomnia, I think and write my way out of the muddle in English, German, or French. Permit me to quote from the afterword to my book. Once, after heartily and gamely shooting the breeze over Russian bubbly at a congenial gathering in the former GDR, the Polish wife of a German friend asked me what in fact my mother tongue was. Good question. The conversation, in which I took a lively part, vigorously affirming and defending my points of view about this and that, was conducted entirely in German, while I communicated shreds of the essential gist in French to my French wife, and every now and then scolded in English my young son, who 2 years of German instruction notwithstanding, made not the slightest effort to exchange a few German words with the neighbor's delightful little daughter. Reflecting for a moment, I gave the following answer. My mother tongue is actually a kind of linguistic wrap. With German, the language I spoke for my entire life with my mother, enveloped by English, whereby I am quite sure that there are forgotten Yiddish sentiments slipped into my eccentric German. The Yiddish, in turn, still studded with Hebrew longings, smuggled out of the desert, the whole generously salted with tears and seasoned with screams. Given that I learned German as a first language, albeit only orally from my mother, German is and remains, for all intents and purposes, my mother tongue. But I grew up in English, and since I only learned to read and write German much later in life as a Fulbright Fellow in Freiburg im Breisgau, German remains for me a language of childhood, or rather a delinquent dialect. As such, he who bears the name Peter Wortsman keeps stumbling on a second I in the clang of German syllables, the Mr. Hyde to his Dr. Jekyll, the shamelessly impertinent creature who allows himself to take liberties that my well-brought-up adult English-speaking I would surely have censored. To have reached at age 66, after years of considerable creative effort in English, the beginner's level in another language is, in my view, no small feat. Something on the order of digging a hole so deep into New York granite that you come crawling back up in China, filthy but still breathing. If as an adult I stutter and stumble with the shaky spoon of my tongue back into the still, fluid forecourt of consciousness that German constitutes for me, I do so in full consciousness as an English speaker, reminded of other syllables that say more to me about the unspeakable than yes and no. Let me lay it on the line, even if it sounds a bit bizarre. I have long suspected, and am now convinced, that I harbor a stillborn scribe of the German tongue in me, who despite everything belongs to the literary tradition from Kleist to Kafka. As a translator, I have a very intimate relationship to that tradition. Every word is an air bubble, every sentence a breath, an exhalation burdened with meaning. With his ear pressed to extinguished lips, the translator acts as a kind of medium who literally derives inspiration transmitted by strange syllables. Translation from one language into another, particularly the words of the dead, is a kind of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in which you breathe new life into expired thoughts. As a writer, things are a bit more complicated. German, for me, if I can be perfectly frank, also harbors a dark subtext. The language of the Dichter und Denker, poets and thinkers, to whom I, in my own modest way, feel a certain kinship, is also the language of the Richter und Henker, judges and executioners. In Auschwitz and Buchenwald, they not only murdered people, they also once and for all time erased the tenuous borderline between nightmare and reality, and thereby devised a new marginal tongue in which consciousness and the subconscious blabber like undivided Siamese twins. Sayings like jedem das seine, to each his own, and Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, and concentration camp jargon like Musulman, a walking dead man, and Canada, the depot in Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the last possessions of the slaughtered were saved and stored, thus the epitome of limitless riches and boundless possibilities, bespeak a black humor that arouses a tickle in the throat that can never be stilled by easy laughter. I am also heir to this German tongue. A word about my conflicted identity. Once upon a time, there was a turbulent cultural melding, a marriage of two peoples that exploded again and again in outbursts of violence, nevertheless bearing rich fruits, a marriage that finally fell apart in a terrible divorce. This German-Jewish union, in the braided double helix of which the souls of the North Sea and the Mediterranean, of mountain climbers and nomad met, a union dating back to Roman times when the Jews first established small settlements along the Rhine, led to some of the heights and the depths of our modern era. One can only imagine a Marx, a Freud, a Kafka, a Wittgenstein, or an Einstein, among many other pathfinders of modernity, at the crossroads of strict German syntax, logic, and idealism, coupled with Talmudic justice and idealism, qualities that on one hand tend to messianism, and on the other, in the case of some Jews, myself included, is bound with a seemingly contrary readiness, namely systematically to break all rules. An elective affinity, perhaps. I would rather call it a productive symbiosis, like that of the bird that lives on the back of the bison and feeds on the insects in its fur before flying off. Only the fleas lose out in the deal. The biblical term ivri, Hebrew, means to cross over. Abraham left his birthplace Ur to seek his fortune elsewhere. Moses led his nation of slaves out of Egypt through the desert and rolled back waves of the Red Sea to find freedom on the far shore. I belong to a tribe of wanderers. Perhaps I carry the nomadic drive of my ancestors in my toes and retain their anxious breath patterns in my lungs. The Germans were also once a wandering people or group of peoples. Modern movements like the Wandervögel and the Kibbutzniks are essentially not all that dissimilar. Perhaps German and Jewish Wanderlust came together in the joints of my knees. Already as a young man, my father, a native Viennese, was often underway somewhere, preferably Paris. Later, my parents were expelled from their homeland. My father, who spoke 7 languages fluently, turned his refugee status into an art de vivre. From early on, he raised us to be travelers. But beneath the pleasure of experiencing the big, wide world and of rediscovering oneself again and again in foreign climes, there was always the underlying notion that we had to learn to leap like a cat, since you could never know when it would once again be time to pick up and go. For me, being Jewish means above all bearing a deeply engraved question mark in my brain as a badge of honor, to be certain only in uncertainty, and as soon as I arrive anywhere, to look around already for the exit door. It always seemed to me as if I'd been born in the shadow of the flames that engulfed my parents' world, as if everything meaningful and significant had already happened before my birth, and that in fact, I had no right to my own experience, because it would always be held to be inconsequential in comparison to what my parents lived through. Strangely enough, it was only on the now canonical date of September 11th, 2001, when the great peril appeared to draw near, and I saw the towers tumble outside my window, that I was freed from the phantoms of the past. The geopolitical ground rules of the game seemed to be changing all around me. My mother, with whom I spoke mostly German, died in 2007. After that, I fell into a Great Depression and for a time stopped sleeping, which also had serious consequences for my health and state of mind. Then in 2010, everything suddenly changed again. As a Holtzbrinck Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, I had the opportunity to experience not only the city of Berlin in all its cultural complexity, but also the sound, the depths of my own prickly relation to German culture and to the German language. I collected and worked my observations, experiences, and memories into the book Ghost Dance into Berlin, A Rhapsody in Gray, which I am happy to say will be coming out in German translation next fall. In 2018, Julia Kissina and Martin Jankowski, to whom I am immensely grateful, invited me to participate in the Berlin, New York Urban Dictionary Literary Festival in Berlin. The writers from New York and Berlin came together to trade tales. And where I first read stories I had written in German to a German-speaking audience. I can't describe to you how gratifying that was. This is not in my written remarks. It was as if some secret members of my family that I had never met were scattered in the crowd and I was reading to them. It felt like the two seemingly disparate sides of myself were finally soldered together. At one of the events, I met Catherine Nicely, the one-woman dynamo of Palm Art Press in Berlin, who was immediately intrigued by the idea of publishing a bilingual book of stories. Well, I'd like to read you a couple of texts. If you'll permit, mostly I'll read to you in English since I don't know how widespread the German knowledge is, but I want to give you a taste of the German since most of these stories were written in German. This is a one paragraph long text to kick things off. Familienmitglieder. My apologies to all families out there. It's probably a somewhat dark notion of family. Familienmitglieder sind nicht so wie andere Menschen. Dünne, unsichtbare Drähte heften sie zusammen an allen beweglichen Stellen, einschließlich der Zunge. Im Unterschied aber zu den Marionetten, bei denen die Bindfäden alle senkrecht gerichtet aufwärts reichen, hinauf zu zwei flinken Händen, die stillgehalten alles leiten, reichen die Drähte des häuslichen Lebens waagerecht und binden die Mitglieder wie Kettensträflinge zusammen, wobei sie, wie gesagt, nicht nur an Knöchelringen gefesselt sind, sondern an jeder erdenklichen Stelle. Man könnte sie auch mit einem Gespann Pferde vergleichen, obwohl die Familie nichts vorwärts zieht als sich selbst. Dabei gibt es weder Puppenspieler noch Kapitän, noch Kutscher, der die Zügel der Zukunft festhält. Die Familie bewegt sich eher wie eine Qualle. Sie schwimmt mit dem Strom, von Neid und Liebe getrieben, auf dem mächtigen Meer der Menschheit. Just to give you a sense of what that is, here's the English version. Like I said, the English versions are never directly translations, they are adaptations of the German. Family members are not like other people. They are attached to each other by thin, invisible wires at every movable part. As distinct from marionettes, however, whose strings all stretch upwards to the fingers of the puppeteer, surreptitiously directing their fate. The wires of domestic life are horizontally strung, binding spouses and their progeny like the members of a chain gang. One could well compare these domestic desperados to a wagon team, though the family drags nothing forward but itself. It advances rather like a jellyfish, teased by the tides, driven hither and thither by the currents of jealousy and love, never going anywhere, until one by one, the members miraculously break free, each in his own way defining himself and dying in the process. Before I continue, Christian, maybe we want to talk a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to. First of all, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Deutsches Haus, for allowing me to be part of this conversation. As Juliana said, I am not a professional literary critic. I'm not a Germanist. I'm just a I'm proud to call myself a friend of Peter's, and I love his writings. So that maybe qualifies me to engage in this conversation. What I want to ask you, Peter, is to delve a little deeper into what you are doing when you are writing in two languages and how that relates to your family history. So on the one hand, you say that it's not a translation, right? It's obviously different if you write in two languages than translating from one language into the other. This creative process is something that um, creates the text twice, that not that doesn't recreate it as a one-on-one copy, but does something else. And I think there is more to it, as you write in the introduction to your fantastic book, and you alluded to that in your introduction just now, when you call your language a linguistic wrap, where at the innermost core is the Hebrew that had to be smuggled out of the desert as a mystery, as something that had to be hidden. And around that is a layer of Yiddish, and around that is a layer of German, and around that finally is the English language.
You can add French to the mix now too, because it's an important part of my life.
Right, is that another wrap, another layer in this wrap?
Because it was there from early on, the French, yes. My father was a great Francophile, and so I got slapped in the face if I mispronounced my French.
As children should be taught languages, as we all know. Given your family history, your parents as refugees from Nazi Austria, an alternative reaction, a conceivable reaction, would have been not wanting to have anything to do with their language anymore. This was not what happened in your family, and certainly not what happened with you as a writer. You're embracing it, but not as a translation, but as something else. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Well, first of all, I have to say, indeed, my parents made what I think was a very wise decision. We're talking about the 1950s, shortly after the end of the war, when many of the other refugees stopped speaking German and stopped. For my parents, as my mother once put it, to stop speaking German would be to cut their tongue out of their mouth and would be to give Hitler a second victory. They always insisted that the language did not belong to Hitler. And I think this was not only a wise decision, but the right decision. This is not to say this is not a naive denial of the history of the past, but simply that this language and this culture belongs to them, and I am somehow a part of it as well. But when I speak German, it's an alternate I inside myself. I can't really put my finger on it. I will read to you the title story, which some of you might find a little strange. To be an heir to this history, you cannot pick and choose. To be an honest heir to the history is a kind of an amoral response. As I said in my introductory remarks, a line has been crossed between nightmare and reality. And I don't think anybody can ever go back on that line once that line's been crossed. It's been done. And so unfortunately, it's not only the plight of the victim that's inside of us, but the perpetrators are there. They're part of us all too. They're part of our culture, because our culture went in that direction and did that, dredged it up out of the unconscious. Can I, in part in response, read you one story now? And then we'll get back. This is the title story. I'm reading it to you in English. In German, it's Stimme und Atem, which resonates much more. I'm an asthmatic, you see, and I'm convinced that voice, or that words are exhalations burdened with meaning. Because as an asthmatic, I know the problem in asthma is the exhalation, not the inhalation. And if you're burdening those exhalations and with meaning, it makes it doubly complicated. Out of breath, out of mind. I was a strange boy, small and shy like every other child. I was sometimes consumed by peculiar thoughts and imaginings. You'd never have suspected it from my fine features and angelic blue eyes. I have to interrupt and say, this is not, strictly speaking, autobiographical. Fiction is not autobiographical. You pick and choose. Other boys got their kicks scuffling with each other, playing war, and with a magnifying glass or the lens of their eyeglasses, focusing the sun's rays on ants until they went up in a cloud of smoke. But that wasn't suspenseful enough for me. My game was thoroughly thought out. I picked out a washed and rinsed glass kosher pickle jar from a garbage can in the kitchen, a box of wooden safety matches, and a Viceroy filter cigarette filched from the pack my father, a recently reformed smoker, kept behind the radiator for emergencies and sudden cravings, beside a pack of playing cards with naked women on the back. I plucked off the filter and saved it for a special purpose. From the drawer of my father's workbench in the basement, I next fetched a hammer and a thick nail with which I banged a hole in the top of the metal cover of the pickle jar. So far, so good. Then I got me some ice cubes from the freezer. I'm thirsty, I muttered aloud, busy meanwhile preparing the Sabbath meal with no inkling of my intentions. My mother merrily recounted how in her youth in Vienna before World War I, giant blocks of ice were delivered. They were carried by a man with a giant pair of pincers, gripping the ice block on his stooped back, graced with a likewise bountiful pincer-shaped mustache, who eyed her with an impish squint that made her tremble with terror, as if he were the devil, and who threatened, if she'd done something naughty, to shove her along with the ice block into the icebox. Things are much easier in America today, my mother said, to which I nodded, oblivious, completely engrossed in my game. I went on an ant hunt in the backyard. Ants are deaf and dumb and as tiny as a grain of pepper, which is why they are so perfectly suited for my game. I poked a twig rubbed with sugar in an ant hole and picked out the fastest. It was a hot summer day. I had to proceed quickly if I didn't want the ice to melt entirely. Tapping the twig gently against the inside of the jar, I managed to dislodge the giant grains of pepper. Some dropped on the ice. Some fell directly in the water and drowned. Most of them ran around like crazy on the ice. A few sought fertile refuge on the inside of the glass jar. Then I screwed the cover shut and with a trembling hand struck a match, muttering in the echo chamber of my head my mother's favorite premonitory maxim, Messer, Gabel, Schere und Licht sind für keine Kinder nicht. Roughly, better not let children touch knife, fork, scissors, matches, and such. Lit up a cigarette, drew on it till it glowed like a red eye. I felt sick in my stomach and had to cough and gasp for air. The smell made me want to puke. What are you doing out there? My mother called from the open kitchen window. I'm playing. Then I struck the glowing cigarette in the hole in the lid, sucked on it several times until the jar filled up with smoke, lay with my belly on the grass and watched as some of the little spots suddenly stopped moving and others ran ever faster around the inside of the jar till one after the other, they all fell into the water. The last one circled for a while till it too finally suddenly stopped and dropped. I breathed deeply in and out. And evenings, long after the Sabbath candles had gone out, the last drop of the chicken soup had been lapped up, and all that was left of the roast chicken was a heap of bones. The family gathered in the living room for my show. Sometimes I sang, sometimes I danced. That evening, I came trampling down the stairs, dressed in rubber boots and a jacket turned inside out, with a belt tightly fastened around my middle, and the filter of a cigarette dyed in black ink stuck as a mustache to my upper lip. Then I extended my right arm in a salute and was about to scream out the most awful things. Everyone watched with rapt attention, hesitating between horror and amusement. That's when my voice and my breathing gave out. They called up Dr. Goldberg, who came and gave me a painful injection in the thigh, the punishment, I thought, for my ghastly game, whereupon I reclined with my left leg twitching until finally I lay still and breathed deeply in and out. The second time it happened in the synagogue at my brother's bar mitzvah. When 11 years old by then, as an honor, I was seated on the bima, the sacred stage, with the heavy Torah scroll on my lap, pressing it hard against my chest, so as to permit the rabbi, with the aid of the cantor, to remove the velvet Torah robe and the silver bangles. Already impatient, the shamus, a sexton, held above my head the silver Torah pointer, with which one called up to read, in this case my brother, could point out and recite aloud the holy letters. Suddenly, I thought of the ice delivery man with the giant pliers. I was supposed to mumble a prayer, or at least an amen, and then my voice and breathing gave out again. I wouldn't let go of the Torah scroll. It was as if the congregation wanted to undress me, and with a pair of silver pliers, wrenched the horrid secrets out of my throat. And then I puked my breakfast all over the bare skin of the holy scroll. Maybe the smoked lox had gone bad. Or maybe I was a little jealous of my brother. Like I said, I was a strange boy. My English-speaking self would never have written that story. My English-speaking self would have censored that. Whereas my German-speaking self, like I said, has the amorality of a child, but with an adult memory. It's hard to say, so that I get, in the language of the German, I can reach elemental formulations that I couldn't in English, because my English, in a sense, it becomes too sophisticated. So my German is considerably less sophisticated. And that very reaching for words makes it, to my mind, interesting and a different voice.
German was the language of your childhood at home.
Yes.
Was this a dialect that was spoken in your home? Was it Austrian German? Was it Southern?
So, to this day, I cannot tell you, when I speak German, whether my German is Wienerisch, German, Yiddish, or some family invented words, since every family invents words as well. I don't know, since I never, up until I went to Freiburg and had to pass a test to enter the university, I had never looked at, even considered written German. I'd never read German, I'd never written German. It is this hidden voice inside. And he's not nice. And he doesn't want to be nice. It's one of my alter egos.
Does this
incredibly liberating to let him out. I'm sorry, go on.
I wanted to ask you if this informality of the language, as opposed to your more, what you describe as more sophisticated English, adds to that ability to voice thoughts that otherwise you would not be able to express?
Definitely. I would not be able to express, in part because it sounds dirty, in part because it sounds, it's just not nice. But somewhere, somehow, it taps something visceral, I found. And, I've made a choice in my life to, rather than avoid topics that I find upsetting, to pursue ambivalence, because ambivalence is an incredibly rich source, especially for a writer, for an artist. And it's for me, it's an endlessly rich source.
The story that you just read, I mean, there are some definitely nightmarish elements. The Iceman with the pincers, right? He looks like an insect himself. Not only does he have those pincers with which he carries the ice, he also has the mustache. Um, and that's not the only story that takes a very dark twist. Das Fallen, the falling. There's this girl. Not giving away too much, but she thinks that she's made of glass, of crystal, and then she actually breaks. So the metaphor all of a sudden becomes real, like in a nightmare. And there are numerous examples throughout the book where in stories where this I'd like to talk a little bit about this dark side of your stories and relate it to your work as a translator, including works from the Romantic period in German literature.
So I have to say, what I studied when I went to Freiburg, I intended to become a folklorist. And I studied under the marvelous Professor Lutz Röhrig. I studied Märchen, fairy tales. And he, in fact, wanted me to stay on and pursue this. But as much as I adore fairy tales, which I've translated and which are a primary influence for me, I wanted to write them, not write about them. I feel like I grew up with fairy tales, and these illusions, these fantastic elements, I think come from that tradition. And certainly my Geschmack, my taste for literature, I just like this dark stuff with a little humorous twist. The other stuff bores the crap out of me. I'm not, into strict realism. I'm not into, I just like that crazy little dark story. You mentioned falling. Maybe I should tell them falling? Let's see. In a short-lived spurt of activity, in an otherwise inert childhood, I took to falling. First, I fell out of bed, and later graduated to tumbling down stairs and out of trees. Falling was pure delight. I did it whenever and wherever and whenever I could. When my first grade teacher, Miss Bone, found me at the bottom of the upstairs stairwell, she cried, "Whatever are you doing down there, Henry?" Henry's another one of my alter egos. "Fallen," I said. "Someone pushed you?" "No, I just felt like falling." "But why?" "It's what I do best." "Henry is well behaved and a very good reader," Miss Bone wrote in my report card. "A delightful child in most respects, were it not for the habit he has of falling. I urgently advise professional counseling. Maladjustment is best addressed early." So they took me to see Dr. Baum. This, by the way, is true. All of our doctors, of course, had these German names. They were all these German Jewish doctors, very much old world doctors. The doctor studied me through his thick-lensed bifocal glasses and raised his cultivated bushy brow. "Well," he said after a while, when I said nothing. "Well," I said back. "Would you like to begin by telling me why you're here?" Dr. Baum suggested, stroking his chin. "Because my teacher told my parents to send me." "But why?" he persisted. "Because she thinks I'm maladjusted." That's a very big word for a little boy. You doctors like big words, don't you? "And why did your teacher suggest that your parents bring you to see me?" "Because I like to fall." Aha, Dr. Baum was taking notes. "But why?" "Because falling makes me feel. Other boys your age play baseball. Have you ever tried to take up baseball? Baseball is a bore." I see, he took more notes. That'll be all for today. The next patient after me in the waiting room was a girl who thought she was made of glass. Her parents had to carry her in. "Break a leg," I said in passing. The girl laughed. That's incredible, her father said. I've never seen Sally laugh. Sally and I became friends. Everybody, including Dr. Baum and Miss Bone, thought it was a good idea. Once a week after my session, I waited for Sally to finish with Dr. Baum, and then I carried her home. Glass girls aren't very heavy. We generally stopped at a bench halfway to rest. I lay Sally flat on the boards beside me because she couldn't bend her crystal knees. Isn't falling dangerous, she wanted to know. No, I said, not if you know how. That night, Sally gathered all her courage and tumbled out of bed, breaking her crystal legs. I never forgave myself. Shaken to the core, I gave up falling in friendship and decided to take up less perilous pursuits. I should say of that.
Thank you.
It's an irony, as ironic take on, there was in my family a wariness of friendship, based in part, no doubt, on my parents' experiences of friends suddenly turning their backs on them. There was a general wariness of friendship. I am a funny mix. I am basically a fairly gregarious individual, and yet friendship was something not necessarily frowned upon, but you always had your doubts about so-called friends.
This is reflected in your stories. There's not a whole lot of happy ends. It's not people who, make friends easily and get along well, and then there's this great adventure that they live through together. But none of that happens. In your stories in general, they don't end very well. The turning point is always where something bad happens, right? And I mean,
it makes for a better story.
Excuse me?
Les gens heureux n'ont pas d'histoire. Happy people have no story to tell.
Yes. Why would you write about uneventful things? Yes. Going back to Stimme und Atem, out of breath, out of mind, the story you read. I mean, it's a true horror story, right? I mean, this boy, he tortures those poor ants,
and we know what that is, form of torture. These are gas chambers.
Yes, it is a gas chamber, and then he comes down the stairs trying to reenact the man with the mustache, and this is where he is out of breath, and the other part of the title, out of mind. If we look at the title of the story, there is an important difference between the English title and the German title. Out of breath, out of mind in English, Stimme und Atem, the title of the story and of the book, it's not the same. Would you ascribe any significance to that difference?
No, but like I said, the English half of this book, it's not a translation. It's as if I've pried loose something with the German, like there's a crate and I pried the wood off the crate and there's creepiness inside and I just want to let it out. I just want to let it out. I don't want it stuffed inside anymore. In English, I became conscious of that in my translations of the work of others. I am very faithful to the original within reason. I still believe Joel Agee was speaking there recently, the last time I was at a real event at Deutsches Haus about translating Musil, and he spoke about the need for faithfulness, but also there is a need to let the voice sing of the original, so you can't be blindly faithful. In rendering my own texts, I have unlimited license. I can do whatever I damn please. I don't have to be faithful to anything. There's no such thing as faithfulness. A story was let out, and in English, I have to make that story resonate, right? And so it's not translating it. it's about madness, the story, out of breath, out of mind, definitely asthma, madness. It's not as nice. I still love the title Stimme und Atem. You know, there's those T's inside. I'm a sucker for alliteration, right? But it's I'm not. It's not a translation. It's just Stimme und Atem. Out of breath, out of mind is the story, the English story released by Stimme und Atem.
But isn't it interesting, and you just said that the German title of your book is so much nicer. It leaves way more hope than the English title. Stimme und Atem could end in anything, right? Out of breath, out of mind has much more of a finality to it.
Also, Stimme und Atem are these elemental words. In my life, for instance, Tod, Liebe, these great abstractions, they resound in my mind in German, not in English, because I still have that memory from childhood. They exist, you know, when I was a kid, death was, we asked, where did Dr. Goldberg go? He went to Florida. Where did Oma go? She went to Florida. So death was a trip to Florida. So needless to say, it's a fairly ominous thing. I don't know if they knew that we knew they weren't telling the truth. My parents' mother in particular really wanted to create a kind of a perfect Garden of Eden. She didn't like all these dark things, these dark stories. But for me, that's what was being hidden. And I desperately needed to get to the truth.
I would like to ask you about the tongue. The tongue is omnipresent in your stories. It's the subtitle of the whole book, Zweizüngige Erzählungen, Two-Tongued Tales. But also as a specific body part. So not just as a metaphor, as something that you use to signify language, but also as the real thing inside your mouth that you use for talking, but you use it for many other things. In general, there is a whole lot of body in your work, in these stories. A lot of these stories revolve around the body, different body parts, and in particular the head. Could you speak to that a little bit? I'm just curious. Where do you see the importance of that?
Well, anyone who knows me knows that I'm not particularly tall, but I have a large head like a bowling ball that sits on my shoulders. So there is a hyper consciousness of that. But the tongue is a magnificent thing. The tongue, you can't see me right now, but those who know me know I'm a big eater as well. So the tongue shovels food into the mouth. The tongue is also, you can attack, you go, you stick out your tongue. This is a very versatile organ. I started my creative life actually as a would-be visual artist. I wanted to be a sculptor, and that's what my brother became, and very wonderfully. But somewhere, somehow, there came a time when I couldn't touch clay anymore, and it moved to words. But my relationship, it's still very much about tasting the reality around me, seeing. A writer I admire very much, Joseph Conrad, said, my task as a writer is to make you see, to make you feel, to make you taste as the reader. And so I hope that the irony notwithstanding, that sensual element is communicated in the stories. I really love food, eating. I love being at table. I love conversation. I love all that you do with the tongue. And when you are raised with more than one language, that is to say more than one tongue, it is both confusing and ultimately, if you go with it, profoundly enriching. As you know and your children know, and Juliana and Sarah, your children know who grow up in this bilingual environment, it's very hard to have prejudices when you know that this is how things are in one language, but they're different in another language, in another culture, and they're different yet in another one and another one. And this sense of relativity, I think, is the most important thing that we can teach our children to prevent the poison, the outrageous poison that's in the air now of exclusion of outsiders, exclusion of refugees, exclusion of, I'm very, very conscious of being the child of refugees and very conscious that that is not only enriching for me, but it's enriching for the country as well, to bring in elements of another culture. And as a translator, I serve that role as well, of bridging gaps between here and there, showing that things are other elsewhere. That's a roundabout answer to the question. I don't know.
Let me take a question from the audience that puts a slightly different perspective on this topic. I'm going to read it in German because it was asked in German and I'm going to translate it. Doppelzüngigkeit bedeutet Transport einer Lüge, keine Wahrheit, oder? And then Schadenfreude ist und bleibt Deutsch auch in New York. But the speaking with a double tongue is like lying. It's not telling the truth. That's a different take on what you just said. Is that a possible interpretation?
Look, fiction is at the same time a bunch of lies, but it only resonates if it taps some sort of truth or truths beside the lies, despite the lies, under the lies. It is a big lie. You know, these stories mostly did not happen the way I described them. They are based in some instances on memories here and there, but yes, it's a big lie. But it is hopefully a lie that taps a truth. That's a paradox, I know, and may not satisfy the person asking the question, but I think that's, after all, what art or literature is. We're playing make-believe like when we were children. We played make-believe, and you know, you little playmates would say, well, I shot you, you're dead now. Okay, I'm dead, but now I'm alive again. All of this make-believe is still terribly important. So the child knows that make-believe is not, strictly speaking, the truth, but it's not a lie either. It's make-believe. It's something in between the two. And I believe that's what I try to do, at least reach for, with my two tongues, with my deceitfulness, with my Mr. Hyde speaking in German. It is a lie, but hopefully it's a lie that taps some sort of truth that will register in some readers, I hope.
Let me follow up on that with a question from Juliana. So you have this practice of writing in 2 languages, but you also translate.
Three actually.
Or in 3 languages.
Yeah.
But you're also a translator, as you described, and as we know. Did this practice of writing influence your translation work, or your work as a translator?
The two started at the same time. It's been frustrating to me to a certain extent in the United States that I am still better known for the translation. For me, it's part of the same package. I consider myself, perhaps an old-fashioned term, a man of letters. And translation is one of my responsibilities, since I was given the privilege of having access to this elsewhere, to this other culture. I believe it my responsibility and my duty to build bridges between the various cultures. So for me, writing and translation are not separate activities. I know that when I'm translating someone else's work, there's different rules. than when I'm adapting myself. But they exist part and parcel. That's the case, for instance, in my play, in both of my plays, Burning Words and the Tattooed Man Tells All. They're both actually inspired by translations. The Burning Words is inspired by my translation of German humanist Johannes Reuchling's landmark defense of freedom of faith and freedom of religion in 1510, and the pursuit by the Dominicans attacking him, wanting to burn all Hebrew books and attacking Reuchling along the way. The play came out of this translation. In the case of The Tattooed Man Tells All, I conducted these interviews with survivors of the camps in 1975, mostly in German, sometimes in a couple of other languages. I then translated the transcripts into English, and so that the play is again based on a kind of translation. It's a kind of a collage. So the two are not separate from me. They never were separate from me. They're part of the same need to tell stories, need to tell how things are there for the people here.
Mm-hmm. Would you want to read another story?
Yes.
At this point?
Sure. Etwas Finsteres oder eher Lustiges?
Finster.
Finster, okay. All right. This is a slightly longish one. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. The Fairy Tale of the Blessed Meal. The following tale was told in the concentration camp Hoffnungslos. One day, SS Unterscharführer Haselbeck, a man who seldom took notice of the world around him, was very surprised to observe that the prisoners in one block licked their fingers every time they dipped them into their miserable slop. Jews, monkeys, and Freemasons have no taste, he muttered half loud to himself. Whereupon a voice whispered in his ear, blessed meal. In his childhood, before he joined the Nazi party, he was raised in a pious home. Every evening, his mother told him, the Lord God thinks of you, even if you don't think of him. Haselbeck shook his head to clear his thoughts. But since the finger licking kept repeating itself, the Unterscharführer became curious. So he asked the prisoner in charge, why do you dirty Jews lick your filthy fingers? Because the food tastes good, Herr Unterscharführer, the latter replied, which really pricked his curiosity. Since the prisoners were given nothing but miserable shreds of meat and bones you wouldn't give a dog, rotten cabbage and potatoes. In school, Haselbeck had learned that Jews are sly and practice black magic. The Jew can turn dung into gold, the teacher said. So Haselbeck hid behind a giant kettle the morning of the weekly delivery of foodstuffs, from which he always siphoned off his share to sell back to the sons of bitches, since every Jew has a secret store of money and of valuables, which he hides up his ass or in some other place for safekeeping. The provender and perishables were taken in by a little man with delicate features and a long nose, who sniffed everything over like a dog and politely thanked the prisoners of the delivery detail. And once the others were gone, and the little man reached for the giant kettle, the Unterscharführer slipped behind an even bigger vat. He looked on with amazement as the curious little man carefully sorted everything, severed the maggoty parts of the meat and the mildewed vegetables with a dull blade of a broken pocket knife, and cut up and rode the rest in even little heaps on a broken cutting board. From each pants pocket, he then pulled out a handful of weed and laid it beside the foodstuffs on the board. And when the little man reached for the kettle and the Unterscharführer had nowhere else to hide, he leapt forth and said, I caught you, you sly devil. What kind of black magic are you plotting with your weed? Who do you plan to poison? A bit taken aback, but keeping his composure, the little man smiled This is no black magic, Herr Unterscharführer, sir. I was a cook at the Hotel Adlon. What kind of foul weed is that you dumped in your brew? There are wild herbs growing in the outlying fields around the camp. I asked the prisoners engaged in the work details outside the camp perimeter to gather them for me. Now the Unterscharführer, who had never set foot, and surely not his nose, in a fancy restaurant, looked on as the little man chopped up meat and vegetables and dropped them into sizzling margarine in the kettle, pouring water in after a while, rubbed the dry vegetables between the palms of his hand so that the crushed leaves fell in and only the branches were left, whereupon he brought it all to a boil. Remember Zunge, right? And time and again, he dipped his spoon in to taste until finally he was satisfied. Would you like to sample a spoonful, Herr Unterscharführer, sir? He asked Haselbeck. Frightened at first, the SS man held back. That chiseler surely wants to poison me, he thought. But when he saw the little man lick his spoon clean with delight, he pulled his service spoon out of his pocket, first dipped it in gingerly to have a little taste, and could not believe his tongue. The stuff was so good. He dipped his spoon in again, this time deep down, and fetched himself a heaping spoonful. This is really delicious, he said to the little man, much better than the stuff they feed us in the canteen. Glad to hear it, the cook smiled back. Such a secret the Unterscharführer initially resolved to keep to himself, to turn to his account later. Every week, Haselbeck was at hand at the scheduled delivery time to oversee receipt of the stock and come back when it was done to relish the result. One day, Haselbeck heard that the commandant's wife wished to prepare a Christmas meal like in the good old days, but that her young Polish cook was pregnant, liable to give birth any day now, and consequently not in any condition to whip up a proper holiday spread. Whereupon Unterscharführer Haselbeck stepped forward and said, Dear Madame Commandant, I know a cook who can perform wonders in the kitchen. Remember Sleeping Beauty? I think it's a Sleeping Beauty. No. Anyway, there's Märchen inside this. Have him brought to me, the woman replied, overjoyed. No, it's Rumpelstiltskin I was talking about, sorry. Naturally, Unterscharführer Haselbeck did not dare confess to the commandant's wife that the cook in question was a prisoner and a Jew to boot. And the next time he visited the cook at the scheduled delivery time in the prisoner's kitchen, the SS man brought him a suit of clothes he'd filched from the clothing repository of the new arrivals. Now go wash up so that you don't stink and put on a decent suit of clothes. You have an important appointment. First, I have to prepare food for the prisoners, Herr Unterscharführer, sir. Duty is duty, the little man protested. The dirty dogs can wait for their slop, Haselbeck screamed. At your service, Herr Unterscharführer, prisoner replied. So the SS man looked around to make sure nobody noticed and took the disguised prisoner with him to visit the commandant's wife. Speak only when spoken to. Don't let slip that you're a prisoner, and for heaven's sakes, not that you're a Jew, or else there'll be trouble. So Unterscharführer Haselbeck introduced the little man to the commandant's wife. She served him tea and cake, and after they'd discussed the weather for a while, and she'd inquired if he thought it was going to rain tomorrow, she sounded him out as to his favorite dish. Whereupon he replied, smothered goose, heaven and earth style. What an odd name for a dish, she remarked. That was the most popular main dish at Christmas time in the great dining room of the Hotel Adlon. Back then, I was a fledgling apprentice in the kitchen. I learned the art of cooking from the chef de cuisine, Monsieur Delivrance, a Frenchman. Ah, the Hotel Adlon, the woman sighed. Once in childhood, my dear old grandpapa took me there for coffee and cake. He pulled out his pipe, stroked his mustache, and laughed with pleasure to see me lick up the last drops of my hot chocolate from the bottom of my cup. It was and remains a smoke-enveloped dream. Smothered goose? Why not? She replied. completely consumed by the memory. But it has to taste particularly good. My husband works so hard. I want to lighten his load for an evening. It would be a great pleasure for me to fulfill your wish, dear lady. So the SS man bid the prisoner prepare a list and fetched him everything he needed. And on the day before the holy night, Unterscharführer Haselbeck brought the prisoner a white chef's coat and pants and a white toque. And the cook cooked up such a splendid feast Christmas Eve that the commandant kept fluttering his eyebrows with pleasure and even licked his lips. The next day, the cook was requested to appear at the commandant's office. The Unterscharführer was a bit concerned. It is one thing to put on a performance for the commandant's wife, and quite another to dare do so before the commandant. But he had no choice. Once having instigated a lie, the truth could cost him incarceration or much worse. That will be all, the commandant commanded the Unterscharführer, whereupon the commandant reached out his hand to the disguised prisoner and politely inquired, with whom have I the honor? Unterscharführer Haselbeck trembled as he peeked through the keyhole and overheard the following conversation. The name is Riesig. The SS man had to smile, his upset notwithstanding, strange name for a little Jewish rascal. You are a veritable wizard in the kitchen, Herr Riesig, the commandant remarked. I have a big favor to ask. I will soon receive a very important guest. Although it's a secret, I can tell you, it's Reichsführer Himmler. I would like you to cook something delicious for him. The only thing is, he's a vegetarian. No problem, Herr Commandant, the cook replied. I'll prepare my smothered goose, heaven and earth style, without the goose. Only I will need some very special herbs. The commandant bid the trembling Unterscharführer return and commanded him to assemble a farming commando and have everything planted that Herr Riesig required. Haselbeck followed orders. A field was planted with all sorts of herbs and vegetables, whereupon the little man said, I will need a barnyard full of geese. Why geese? The Reichsführer is a vegetarian after all, the Unterscharführer protested. The geese are only needed to produce the dung to enrich the herbs, potatoes and apples. What a shame to waste the good flesh, the Unterscharführer winked. So Haselbeck had the prisoners build a barnyard and filled it with fat geese from Hungary. The cackling of the geese disturbed the commandant in his work. The fowl must disappear at once, he commanded the unnerved Unterscharführer. If you please, Herr Commandant, sir, the cook needs the geese to prepare the meal for your important guest, the Unterscharführer replied. Dismantle the barnyard at once and move it to the camp. The racket is intolerable. It disturbs my concentration. At once, Herr Commandant, sir, replied the Unterscharführer, who put together another commando to dismantle and rebuild it in the camp. The prisoners' rations tasted better every day. Scents and rumors circulated around the entire camp. Then came the day for the important visit. The little prisoner was once again dressed up as chef de cuisine and brought to a kitchen especially outfitted for the occasion by the commandant to prepare the meal. The following rumor circulated. Reichsführer Himmler liked the appetizers well enough, but when he tasted the main dish, he almost fainted. He liked it so much he asked for a second serving. I want to meet the cook, he ordered. At once, Herr Reichsführer, replied the joyous commandant, who had the little man called in from the kitchen. My congratulations, said the Reichsführer, his glasses all fogged up with the steam of the savory broth. That was some meal. What is the main dish called? Smothered goose, heaven and earth style, Herr Reichsführer, said the prisoner. At these words, the important person almost choked. Everybody knows that I'm a vegetarian, like the Führer himself. The dung and the cackling nearly helped fortify the potatoes, apples, and herbs, Herr Reichsführer. You look familiar to me. Where did you learn to cook? In the Hotel Adlon before the war, my Führer. The prisoner replied. Impressed, the Reichsführer asked for the recipe and for a care package for the return trip to Berlin, what the Americans call a doggy bag. Gladly, my Führer. And what was in the doggy bag? Goose droppings, of course. So they said in the KZ Hoffnungslos, where for a while the prisoners supped on savory goose stew. Not a living soul can confirm the truth of the rumor, and surely not a smothered goose. And what became of the cook? Did he survive the camp? After the war, he is said to have run a small restaurant in Berlin. And one day the former commandant, who had in the meantime changed hats and became the director of a wholesale grain business, came to eat. Was he not arrested and condemned? There is no record of the KZ Hoffnungslos. When the cook poked his head out of the kitchen and saw him enter the restaurant with his wife, he was anxious at first. But when he saw the expression on the faces of his guests, when they read smothered goose, heaven and earth style on the menu, he smiled to himself. The goose was ordered, roasted, and served. The grain merchant poked around in his plate, but his wife, who had in the meantime put on considerable weight, furtively licked her fingers and was just gnawing on a bone when the cook came out of the kitchen and introduced himself. We know each other from before. Impossible, muttered the stunned grain merchant. Indeed we do, replied the cook, turned to the wife. Greetings, dear lady. Herr Riesig from the Hotel Adlon. She smiled, a bit disconcerted. Klein, from the KZ Hoffnungslos, the cook corrected. Whereupon the woman cackled, jerked her head back like a goose, and choked on the bone. But fairy tales are supposed to have happy endings. What's not to be happy about? The grain merchant went bankrupt. Klein took over the business. And mankind, what did they learn from it all? Not a thing. But in the barnyard, you can still hear to this very day a satisfied cackle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. I'm not going to ask you any question about this story because I think it's perfect. It perfectly wraps up what you have read so far. And I will now turn it over to the audience because there are quite a few questions in the Q&A chat. And I will just read you one, and then you can maybe answer it. We can talk about it, and then I'll go through the questions as they come in. Marianne Policinelli asks, what you have been saying speaks to me of the work of Ophelia Garcia, Tatiana Klein, and others around translinguaging, the way that all bilinguals communicate using their entire linguistic repertoire to make meaning. This brings together the different I in each bilingual person. It is the way we communicate, the way we make meaning for ourselves and those with whom we communicate. It is a way to integrate all we are and all we can do. Now, there isn't really a question there, but I thought that was a very thoughtful comment. Would you like to say something about that?
And it is, by the way, a very American story. I mean, my version of it happens to be German, Jewish, World War II, but so many of the people that I grew up with had two languages at home, two cultures, two heads in a sense, two tongues. And it's not really a question. It's a very rich statement, and it's a statement that I completely agree with. I don't know the writers or the theorists that she mentioned, but I wholeheartedly concur.
Let me ask you a question that Jeffrey Raven has asked, because it goes very well with what you just said. Peter, your work celebrates the rich tradition of the cosmopolitan global American. In this fraught time of resurgent nativism, can you speak to your work as somehow an affirmation of the complicated, interwoven, and universal American fabric?
Like I said, I am very conscious of being the child of refugees. The Flüchtlinge, even the word Flüchtlinge sounds a little bit like Geflügel, and it's very, I confused it when I was a child. My parents spoke of the fellow Flüchtlinge as Refugeln. This was probably a Viennese-ism, but it sounded like Geflügel to me. It all had to do back with food anyway. Uh, it is an American story. We all of us have these elsewhere mixed in with the here, bits of tragedy that mark who we are, our lives today. The richness of a place like New York is, you can ask the question, and I do ask the question of strangers, where are you from? Where does your father come from? Where your parents come from? Almost like out of the Odyssey when you're meeting somebody. Whereas I found elsewhere, people might take offense by that question. I mean no offense. I really want to know, who are you? Who were you? And who will you become? And this, I'm keenly conscious that it's the words we heard early on, in the language we heard early on, that are formative in our manner of thinking. And I want to add, most importantly, that America, as elsewhere, and particularly here, the richness of this nation is an embrace of the refugees and children of refugees and all of the knowledge and wisdom and otherness that they bring to this place. That has always been the strength of this country. That is currently being threatened in a very primitive manner. And that is something we must fight for if there's any value to this country, or any country for that matter, any country open to others, to elsewhere. You know, Angela Merkel made a very wise and brave move when she first opened the door to the refugees pouring in. The problem is, in Europe as elsewhere, is of course, how does Europe address it? But it is fundamentally, there are always problems, but it is fundamentally enriching to the host nation, this other element. Fundamentally, it expands your way of thinking, it expands the horizons, it expands everything.
Mm-hmm. I will read a question asked by Nicole that has to do with the difference between German and English. In the first piece of writing you read, the German ended with following the stream of the masses. The English version ended with a breaking off, and yet also with a breaking free, with a liberating moment. I wonder if you could say a few words about this decision. Could it in fact be the English nevertheless that enables this liberation?
I can't speak, it's calling for me to take a distance from the texts themselves, which came out in an altogether naive fashion. Ideally, not always, but ideally, I don't decide where a sentence will go. Ideally, if it's all working, this writing process, it tells me where it wants to go. Ideally, at its best, and I haven't enjoyed this for quite a while and I'm feeling frustrated, at its best, I feel like an empty vessel of flute that some story is suddenly blowing through and I have to quickly take dictation and take it down. That doesn't mean I don't chisel at it and work at it and make sure my verbs are right and make sure, but ideally, I don't know what I'm doing. Can I confess to that? You know, that's the truth of the matter. That's the truth of the matter. I did not choose the way the English would end, or not consciously choose and say, well, it should end such and such a way because English is this way. It is true that English for me, by my experience, is more of a material tongue, less of an abstract tongue. That's my relationship to English. And that may have been reflected in this choice. And that German is, for me, in my experience, infinitely more sensual, infinitely more, less abstract.
Could we apply Freudian theory to this? Is it the id? Is it the subconscious that speaks German, that writes in German?
Definitely. When I say jokingly that I have a dead German or a stillborn German scribe in me, definitely you could call it the id. You could call it, call it what you want. It is essentially what every artist looks for and follows. Every artist who doesn't have a pre-imposed plan as he or she goes along. Since I write mostly, I have written novels, but mostly very short texts, I really can permit the sentence to go where it wants. And that for me is the most pleasurable kind of writing at all.
Mm-hmm. So Nicole's thesis stating that it is some kind of liberation that the rational English part of your writing brings to the subconscious, you would not subscribe to that.
Well, let me put it this way. When I speak English, I'm an adult. Mm-hmm. When I speak German, I'm a child. And when I move from German to English, I am tapping a child's, not necessarily just a child's memory, but a child's mode of consciousness, but crystallizing it. I've almost, in English, I feel like a mechanic. The engine runs, but I'm tightening this and tightening that and tinkering with this in ways that I can't really do in German because my vocabulary is more limited in German. I lived there 1 year in Freiburg and then 6 months when I was in Berlin, but I've never really lived for extended periods in a German-speaking context. So my language, my German is primitive, you can say. Some people also have said that my German is pre-war German. It doesn't include many contemporary words. That may very well be the case. My father, I remember telling me, had a hard time reading Günter Grass because he found that there was so much terminology, ways of thinking that were foreign to him as from a pre-war time.
Mm-hmm. I have one question in the chat. It's anonymous. What other contemporary German language authors do you read and appreciate? Why do these works capture your interest? Are there any?
I don't know contemporary German literature very well at all. I decided not to become a scholar, so I only read what I'm actually driven to read. There is an East German writer I like very much, but whose name I can't recall. I can't say. I like short texts, and so the novels that threaten to become these epic works, they could be great works of literature. It's just not my thing. Mm-hmm. I really love, at best, these concise observations, little texts, Kafka kind of stuff, Robert Walser. I can't say, but someone could probably tell me who might be doing something kindred nowadays. I'm not so sure. Certainly, my friend Tess Lewis would be more knowledgeable to answer that.
Mm-hmm. Are there any more questions from the audience? Please, yes. Kevin asks, I will read it in German. Wie würdest du den Unterschied zwischen Englisch und Deutsch beschreiben? Ich habe gehört, dass Deutsch ist sehr logisch und final und reflektiert die deutsche Kultur, aber es gibt keine Wörter, das Englisch beschreiben kann. So they know the German is very logical and final and reflects German culture, but there are no words that can describe English.
Well, English, let me say first of all, is a hybrid tongue. English, in a sense, is the Battle of Hastings with the Norman victors claiming the elegant words and the German Anglo-Saxon defeated being stuck with the poor people's words. And English to this day is still that mélange of languages. And as such, it is still a fairly flexible language. Now, as much as I adore the logic of German, it isn't that grabs me about German. I have to say it's the German sentence. And with that, I really go to somebody like Kleist. There is something gorgeous about the architecture of a German sentence. This has taken me time to appreciate. Kleist is very complicated stuff, but the use of the semicolon, for instance, the use of various clauses in one sentence, it tolerates greater doubt in my mind than certainly what became the English norm, let's say after Hemingway. I'm not saying everybody writes like Hemingway, but Hemingway preached for a kind of simple sentence, a simple narrative sentence, whereas the German sentence at its best is so infinitely rich. And this will confuse the questioner, Kevin. It isn't the logic that gets me. I'm not a very logical person. My son is infinitely more logical than I am. My wife is infinitely more logical. I don't read philosophy. I love the German sentence. I love the sensuality of this parallel nature of these clauses separated by the semiclause, which is, after all, it's not a period, but it's more definite than a comma. It says, this is all true, and this is also all true, and it's all happening at the same time. And I really adore that in a sentence. And I see that most vividly in a Kleist sentence or a Kafka sentence.
Just to follow up, do you see it also in English literature work, like writers like David Foster Wallace or Thomas Pynchon, who do have these very elaborate sentences and clauses, and also major works? Those books are very, very long. Is it the same as what you find in Kleist, or is there a difference, even though they're also very elaborately constructed?
Well, the difference for me is autobiographical. That is, my relationship to the German is such that I am moved in ways that Pynchon and Wallace I admire. But first of all, as I've told you, I don't really love long books. So, that probably, I shouldn't be confessing that, but I don't. I think it asks too much of the reader. I'm immensely grateful to the reader for giving me a few moments of his or her life for me to entertain them. I feel duty bound to respect the need to entertain my reader, but I think it asking too much for me to say, let me borrow your life for 500 pages. Mm-hmm. I know your own life is much too busy and rich to be bothered with my imposing myself on it. So that doesn't completely answer the question. I would say that Henry James is a closer example of the kind of complex sentence with multiple clauses that I'm talking about. Whereas James was probably more influenced by French, which he spoke fluently, than by German, but it's more that kind of a sentence. Mm-hmm. Is not generally found in American English writing today.
I have one final question in the chat, and it's my favorite question of the evening. Do you dream in German or in English? There's more to that question, but this is the part that I'm going to pick out. Do you dream in German or in English?
Both. Mm-hmm. I guess it depends on where I am, what I'm obsessed with for the moment. And sometimes French creeps in as well. French has a different relationship. I have a different relationship to French. I would say more that I feel German and think French, which is funny, again, because the cliche of German is this logical, rational, the language of Kant, the language of the philosophers, but that's not the German I love. Mm-hmm. The storyteller's German that I love. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Going over time?
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you everyone. For the final words, I hand things over to Juliana, but this was fantastic. Thank you.
I enjoyed myself immensely. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Juliana. As always, I feel very much at home at the Deutsches Haus.
Oh, thank you both, Peter. Thank you, Christian. I'm so grateful for this rich and absolutely facettenreiche conversation you both engaged in. And I think that provided all of us with lots of thought. It certainly did that for me. And I was just thinking about the whole question about Doppelzüngigkeit and truth and Wahrheit and the double-tonguedness. And I thought that could, in a way, tie in very nicely with what Werner Herzog likes to say about his movies. And when he's being asked, especially regarding his documentaries, is that really the truth? Or stimmte das wirklich? War das die Wahrheit? And he likes to speak of the ecstatic truth. And I think your Doppelzüngigkeit is in the service of another reincarnation of the ecstatic truth. And I think this way it all works out beautifully. And the make-believe, as you call it, and the truth are not two different things necessarily. So having said that, again, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and don't forget to vote. Wählen Sie bitte and wählen Sie richtig. All right, we have an audience in the room as well, but again, have a nice evening. Come back for our events, and Peter and Christian, continue your wonderful work. And I think it's also
I hope we'll all get to La Lanterna de Vittorio soon to have our lychee martinis.
I'm counting the days. Good night, everybody. Good night. Auf Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen. Thank you so much.